unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. 2 summers ago, my colleague Ashley Tellis published an essay in Foreign Affairs titled America's Bad Bet on India, which led to an extended debate about the future of the U.S. India relationship. Now, just a few weeks ago, Ashley has published another big picture piece in Foreign Affairs titled India's Great-Power Delusions, which has already got people talking. In his new piece, Ashley argues that India is on its way to becoming a great power, but perhaps not the kind of power that many in the world are expecting. As I'm sure our listeners will know, Ashley holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment. He served in the U.S. government during the George W. Bush administration, where he was intimately involved in negotiating the U.S. Indian civil nuclear deal. To discuss his new essay and the larger implications for Indian foreign policy, I am pleased to welcome Ashley back onto the show. Ashley, congrats on another fine foreign affairs piece, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan. It's always great to be back.
So I want to jump right into your piece, and I want to start by doing a little bit of history. And some of this history might seem rather basic for our listeners, but I think it's important to kind of set the stage. You start your piece by noting that since the year 2000, the United States has sought to help India's rise as a great power. And in making that case, you quote George W. Bush as promising that the United States would help India become a major world power in the 21st century. You note that, the rationale for Bush's pledge was pretty simple. Given that you served in the administration, maybe just tell us about what President Bush's simple rationale was at the time. And has that rationale for the U.S.-India partnership changed over time?
So President Bush set out to transform the relationship in the aftermath of the Cold War. And there was a burden of the Cold War when relations between the United States and India suffered various degrees of alienation. And Bush wanted to overcome that alienation very decisively. And that's the context in which he proposes the civil nuclear deal, which was meant to emphasize to India that the United States was going to be a reliable partner. Now, what was the driving motivation behind this deal? I think there were 2 motivations that came together in very nice ways. The first was the conviction that aiding India's rise was in U.S. interest. And that if the United States helped India rise, both countries could work together to protect the liberal international order. That was the vision that underlay President Bush's judgment that a new relationship with India was desirable and important for the United States.
And tell us a little bit, Ashley, about how motivations might have changed over time, right? Because now you hear justifications having to do with the size of India's economy, with the robust kind of diaspora, this kind of, human migration corridor. What were the things that were kind of added on in subsequent years that may not have been a part of President Bush's original intention to kind of, reset this relationship?
So all those elements were present to some degree or another. But I think the driving element was that Bush saw a good relationship with India as critical to preserving a wider balance of power that was favorable to U.S. interests. Now, remember, when this decision to aid India was made, it was done at a time when U.S.-China relations were actually in relatively good shape. And so the administration's calculations were that if we repaired our relationship with India, while enjoying a good relationship with China, what in effect we would unleash was a virtuous cycle of cooperation, because the United States could cooperate with both, and that would be mutually reinforcing. Now, unfortunately, something has changed since the time those decisions were made. And that is U.S.-China relations now have become more and more competitive. And the consequence of that is that the hard choices that India did not have to make in yesteryears are now hard choices that U.S. policymakers are increasingly contemplating. And those hard choices are essentially boiled down to what can India do for us in the context of this new rivalry with China. we saw the first appearance of this kind of calculation in the first Trump term. And my suspicion is that in the current Trump term, these sentiments will only intensify. So there are two questions I think are increasingly going to surface. And the first question is, okay, we may support India's rise still, but what are we going to get out of this? And then the second question, which is a little more disconcerting, is people will begin to ask the question more fundamentally about whether India's rise itself is in U.S. interest. And this question is asked now against the shadow of the experience with China, because we did make decisions about aiding China 40 years ago only to create a competitor. And I think it has occurred to at least some people in the Trump administration that if one pursues a strategy of aiding India's rise, 40 years hence, U.S. policymakers might end up in a position that they'll have to ask the same question about India that they're now asking about China.
Okay, so let's come back to this because I think this is a very interesting point and it's worth dwelling on. But let me kind of come at it through a different way. The main thesis of your new foreign affairs essay is that India's relative weakness, its desire for multipolarity, and its current illiberal trajectory, when you take those together, mean that India will have less global influence than it desires, even when it can justifiably call itself a great power, and others may treat it as a great power as well. I want to kind of go into each of these factors, and let me start with what you call relative weakness. One of the things you focus on in the piece is India's economic growth trajectory, right? And you say, look, no matter how impressive India's more recent performance has been post-1991 and the liberal reforms, the country has fallen short of China's reform era achievements. Help us understand, in your mind, how you see India's performance and contrast it with the Chinese performance.
So let's go back to sometime around 1979 or 1980. Around that time, the Indian and Chinese economies were roughly similar in size. After Deng's reforms, looking at China today, the Chinese economy is close to 5 times the size of the Indian economy. And this differential in performance is simply a function of China's growth rates since 1979 to date. So during this period, China has grown on an average until very recently at about 9% every year. India, in contrast, which reformed a decade later, grew only on an average of about 6.5%. And that differential in annual growth is really what accounts for the differences in economic capability today between the two parties. So it's not that India's 6.5% average growth is unimpressive or inconsequential. It's just that it is less impressive when you compare it to its northern neighbor, whose economic performance during this similar time frame has really been nothing but meteoric. And it's that point that is emphasized in the piece when it talks of relative weakness.
Ashley, let me come back to the point that you just made, which is, okay, India's had a pretty impressive growth trajectory, nothing like what China has experienced. Therefore, would you say the Trump administration's fears of potentially setting up a peer competitor are misplaced? Because frankly, as you note in the piece, India still lags behind China and the United States, of course, on so many fundamental economic indicators.
I think that's right. I mean, if one looks simply at, the empirical logic, I think expecting that India will become a major power rival of the United States anytime soon is an exaggerated fear. But you must understand it from the viewpoint of U.S. policymakers. If they were asked in 1979 whether China would one day become a great power competitor of the United States, most U.S. policymakers would say, not in our lifetimes. And yet we've seen this come about in our lifetimes. times, right? So it's the shadow of China that really leads us to this question of whether we can find ways of avoiding replicating the same experience with India.
Let me just stick on the growth trajectory for a second. I mean, you say, look, when you look around the world, many commentators are kind of putting their stock on China continuing to slow down. And you say, look, even if this does come to pass, it's not going to guarantee that India catches up. And I just want to quote something that you write in the piece, which is that based on current trends, the Indian economy is unlikely to match its Chinese counterpart before the middle of the century, if at all. What would it take in kind of concrete terms for you to be wrong here, right? For India to actually get to where it wants to go?
So if India somehow magically managed to change what I think will be the trend growth rate of 6% over the next 2.5 decades into something closer to double-digit growth, or even double-digit growth itself. And this performance is matched by a Chinese slowdown that is even worse than it currently is, right? So we estimate that China is probably growing at somewhere around 4%. People even doubt that, but let's take that at face value, that they're growing at 4%. So if you could imagine that China drops to a growth rate below 2%, while India comes closer to double-digit growth rates, then I think you could get a situation somewhere around 2050 where the Indian economy rivals that of China and probably barely exceeds it. You have to do the arithmetic to find this out. But that's the kind of the magnitude difference that you need to find in performance.
Let me come now to the second factor, which has to do with the principles of Indian foreign policy. You note that if India wants to constrain Beijing, and that is its objective, it's going to need Washington's help to do so. But it is constrained in fully exploiting the U.S. relationship because of its commitment to multipolarity. Now, I think a lot of lay people would say India talks about multipolarity, it talks about multi-alignment, it talks about strategic autonomy. But if you look at the overall trajectory of the last quarter century, it has moved very decisively towards the West and more specifically towards the United States. So does its stated commitment on paper to follow or to desire a world that is multipolar, have any bearing in fact, given the moves it's actually made to kind of sidle up to the United States?
Well, it's certainly made a decisive shift in orientation, but I'm not sure that decisive shift is manifested in the details. So even as India has gravitated more closely to Washington, since 2001, the fact remains that there are still substantial inhibitions that prevent India from working closely with the United States in the way that George W. Bush had imagined it to be. And I'll give you 3 dimensions where there are still significant gaps. First, even though there are significant complementarities between the US and the Indian economy, I would say that we have failed to really deepen economic integration between the two sides. And this is not simply a matter of trade performance, though that's part of it, but the kind of synergistic complementarity of the economy that we had hoped to develop is still a long ways away. Second, when you think in terms of geopolitical relations, right? India is closer to the United States today than it has ever been. But it still retains relationships with other countries, some of which the United States is uncomfortable with. And that is, of course, India's prerogative. But the consequence of that is that Washington then becomes hesitant about how far it can go in terms of cooperating with India, especially in areas that India identifies as a priority, like, for example, high technology cooperation. I mean, there have been several instances in the recent past where the United States has consciously refrained from going as far as it could because of India's relations with, for example, Russia. And I understand the logic of India maintaining these partnerships with others, but it has had an inhibiting effect on the United States and could intensify in time. So when one talks about multipolarity and multi-alignment, it's not that India has shied away from an embrace of the US, but it's not willing to embrace the US with the wholeheartedness that we see, for example, on the part of many of our friends and partners. And I think that simply happens to be a reality. And then the last element that many have pointed out is in defense cooperation, where even though it has become so much more expansive than it has been, heretofore, the kind of intimacy in defense cooperation that we would like to see is still elusive. So has India moved towards the United States? Absolutely. I think it's recognized that it can't afford not to have a good relationship with the US. But I think we are still some distance away from the kind of relationship that would allow us to prioritize India above much else.
So let me just kind of push you on this point with a specific kind of counterexample, right? So one of the things you say in the piece is that India's pursuit of multipolarity means that India kind of gets entangled in these eclectic partnerships, I think is the word that you use, with various countries or groupings of countries, many of which have very anti-American agendas, right? So take one of those, which is the BRICS, right? Some Indian analysts will say, look, India doesn't have any great hopes for the BRICS in and of itself, but it finds a grouping like that to be a useful tool to try and keep the West in line, because it's not getting any joy, would say, getting a seat at the UN Security Council or reforming the international financial institutions. It can use the BRICS as a kind of cudgel. So I guess the question that comes out of this is how much of this is performative as opposed to actual principled?
So you've put your finger on exactly the right point, right? India uses many of these partnerships with third parties, not because these third parties have any intrinsic value to India, but because it serves as an instrument of diversifying the bets that it makes on the United States. And so the moment India does that, what starts out as performative fades into relationships that impose objective constraints on US interests. So it's not that India goes towards the BRICS or the SCO because it thinks there's something there of value comparable to the US. But the very act of playing in that sandbox ends up setting some thresholds beyond which India will not go with the United States. And it's in the juggling of those two realities, right, that I think there is frustration on the part of US policymakers. So again, India's calculations are completely understandable, but because it has certain psychic effects on the way India is perceived in the United States, it then ends up creating objective constraints on our cooperation.
So let me just ask you one more question on India's kind of foreign policy orientation. The kind of bottom line in your analysis is that, look, under a system of multipolarity, India could end up worse off than it is under American unipolarity, which may be a thing of the past, or than it might be under U.S.-Chinese bipolarity. And I wonder if you could just for a second contrast those other two scenarios. I think we have a sense of what India under multipolarity would look like and what the downsides are. But how would India fare in a bipolar order in which the US and China are the two poles, or in a kind of hegemonic order where the US is the sort of dominant power?
So just again, now we'll bore our listeners with, sort of elementary IR here, but just, sort of humor me for a few moments, right? American unipolarity works best for India when U.S. India relations are exceptionally good. When the bilateral relationship is deep, unipolarity is the best of all worlds because it does not undermine American power. And America can essentially support India without any hesitations because of the strength of that bilateral relationship. Problem is, when India pursues a strategy of playing all sides against the middle, that's where you begin to see the complications that are imposed on India. So let's look at bipolarity, for example. India did quite well during the Cold War under conditions of bipolarity. But that is because it had relatively good relations with both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was able to play one against the other. A future US-China bipolarity will not be comparable because India has deep difficulties with one of the poles and it has a good relationship with the other, but its ability to derive benefits from the party that it has good relationships with depends very much on how the great power, the hegemonic power in question, the United States, begins to see India's value for itself in that contest with China. And so the temptations to ask of India things that it may feel uncomfortable to do will become more and more prominent in the context of a US-China bipolarity. So it's going to be a different experience of bipolarity compared to that of the Cold War bipolarity, where essentially India was in good terms, more or less, with both Washington and Moscow. I find multipolarity in many ways to be the most tantalizing and also the most problematic. I understand India's desire for multipolarity because it's essentially the precondition for India enjoying its own place in the sun. But the dangers of multipolarity for India are actually quite profound because among all the great powers, India is the weakest. And multipolar systems are notorious for failures of balancing because of this phenomenon called buck passing. Because everyone expects the others to do the balancing because they don't want to pay the price for doing the balancing. Now, if India gets trapped in this predicament of buck passing, it could end up finding itself in the worst of all worlds. Because if the US and the other players like the EU fail to balance China, then India will be essentially left holding the bag. And so multipolarity has promise, but it also has terrific pitfalls. And if you are a rational actor, and especially if you are the weakest in the quartet, then I would be a lot more cautious about multipolarity than Indian policymakers seem to.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Let me come to the third of the three elements you explore, Ashley, which is kind of India's domestic transformations. You highlight a pattern of democratic backsliding and rising illiberalism. And I think the question that many critics would ask after reading your piece is, what does democratic backsliding, if we accept that that's occurring, have to do with India's foreign policy objectives, right? Because I think many would look to their neighbor to the north and to the east, to China, and say, well, look, authoritarianism hasn't stopped China from becoming a great power, so why should India be judged by a different yardstick?
So it's a complex relationship, right, between domestic policy and foreign policy. But let me say the following, which may provide some clues as to how to think about this. Authoritarianism, illiberalism has not stopped China from becoming a great power, but it has certainly taken a toll. Today, China spends more on internal security than it does on external defense. And it has an external defense budget, which, if the U.S. intelligence community is to be believed, is actually close to $700 billion or thereabouts. it spends much more on internal security. And it spends so much on internal security despite having a population that is highly homogeneous. 91% of the Chinese population is Han. And despite having the benefits of such homogeneity, China has to spend a lot of money on internal security. Now, India's position is much more complex. It has much greater social, economic, and cultural diversities. It is a much weaker state. And so, to the degree that illiberal politics complicates India's ability to maintain internal peace, its pathway to great power status becomes harder. Now, none of this is a given, right? We are not drawing any straight line extrapolations between illiberalism and a failure to become a great power. But I think it is worth considering that if India's domestic heterogeneities increasingly intensify because of a rise of illiberalism in its politics, then I think it is worth asking the question about whether the illiberalism is worth it, especially given that there is a constitutional inheritance that guarantees exactly the opposite. The Indian Constitution is built on the edifice of liberal democracy. India does not have to deviate from that constitutional edifice. And if the price of that deviation is both greater frictions with respect to power production and the loss of India's exemplary status in the world, because it has been a very successful liberal democracy despite being a developing country, then I think, the liberal project internationally really loses as a result.
I mean, I want to kind of tie this together with kind of, the United States and its own trajectory, right? Because when it comes to the United States' foreign policy equities, you write that the U.S. has tolerated India's behaviors in the past, in part because both countries were largely liberal democracies, right? So if India exhibited a certain amount of nativism or chauvinism or protectionism or promiscuity with respect to other partners, it was okay because we had this kind of bedrock of shared values. Now, we've been focusing primarily on if India becomes more liberal or less democratic, but obviously the same question could be asked of our own country, the United States. So what happens in a world in which both India and the United States become less democratic and more illiberal?
So I think if that outcome were to occur, and it's already occurring.
I mean, that's the direction we're clearly heading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the real question is whether that trajectory is permanent. If one assumes that that trajectory is permanent, that the United States and India both become illiberal democracies, then I would say that's a double tragedy. That it's neither good for each nor for both. Now, I would say India can't change the US trajectory, but it can shape its own. And therefore, it ought to do its damnedest to protect the inheritance of liberal democracy because it's good for itself, irrespective of what happens in the United States. Now, for reasons that have nothing to do with India, I would like to see the United States return to the path of liberal politics, because even that has an impact on our own power production, right? To give you a very simple example, a liberal United States would have a very different attitude to immigration. It would have a very different attitude to the primacy of the rule of law. It would have a very different attitude to the respect for persons and international cooperation across borders. And yet, on each of these issues, rising illiberalism is taking a toll. And while we can decry that toll at an ideational level, because it disfigures, this shining city on the hill, when it comes to the question of power politics, we have to be concerned because it weakens the material foundations of American power. And to that degree, illiberalism in the United States not only imposes an ideational penalty, it also imposes a material penalty. And we are likely to see this most concretely on the issues of immigration, where if you look, for example, at the shape of the US population pyramid 25, 30 years out, if we do not have access to open immigration, we are going to end up looking like many of the states that we would prefer not to become. States where the dependency ratios are extremely high, states which do not enjoy a large cohort of the productive population, and so on and so forth. And that has real implications for the future of American power. So I would simply say that, a rising illiberalism in the United States that ends up being its permanent terminus is not going to be good for the United States, irrespective of what happens in India.
Just to pause on this for a second, I mean, this also has consequences for the U.S. India relationship because India has been a massive beneficiary of America's liberal, open immigration policies, particularly those policies which have been in place now for the last, 60 odd years that prioritize high-skilled immigrations from a country like India. And so therefore, it's not just that it will have material impacts in a negative direction for us, but this will also redound negatively to India as well.
Absolutely. Now, for the moment, people seem to think that we can obviate the worst consequences by essentially utilizing Indian labor in CETA. So Indian labor does not have to migrate to the United States. They can work, in a sense, in offshore locations within India while still supporting the rise of the Indian economy, the U.S. economy. I would say that works to a point, but at the end of the day, it does make a difference if the United States is fertilized by high-skilled Indian labor, by high-skilled labor from a variety of other countries, right? So this is really something that will affect both India and the United States. And I, on this count, at least worry more about the United States than I do about India.
So I want to just come to another aspect of India's domestic transformations, which again is kind of more in the economic vein. Towards the end of the piece, you write that if India's continuing growth remains largely tied to domestic market expansion, but not international integration, there are real downside consequences, right? Because first of all, its ability to grow faster will inevitably be constrained because it will have limited access to markets abroad. I'm curious whether on this score you see any signs of reversal, right? Because we know in recent months, India has reached a trade accord with the United Kingdom. It's actively negotiating pacts with both the European Union and the United States. There are reports today which suggest as early as July 8th, which is a day before the president's self-imposed deadline, the U.S. and India could announce some kind of early agreement. Do you think that on this score, we could debate the reasons behind it, there has been a shift from the kind of Indian perspective?
I mean, I'm hopeful, but I see all the agreements that India has reached in recent months to be evidence of a tentative rather than a transformative shift. India is still very much focused on how to accelerate exports. And it is driven to these new trade agreements essentially by a desire to find export markets. But I still see a reluctance with respect to an open-ended embrace of integration. In other words, India's free trade agreements, are not entirely free trade agreements. They are driven by a desire to access capital from abroad, to access markets from abroad. But I still don't see an openness to allow foreign partners to sort of walk into the Indian market and discover bigger opportunities for themselves. I hope that comes in time, but at the moment I still see this as a glass, half full rather than a glass entirely full.
Actually, I know that you spend a lot of your time not just thinking about India, but also thinking about China. Let me just ask you a question on this front. A lot of your piece, as I read it, assumes that the United States has a coherent China policy, because once you assume that, you see very logically how India fits. But as you know better than most people in Washington, it's not necessarily an assumption that one can bank on anymore, right? Because you and I have talked to a bunch of people in Washington, including the administration on Capitol Hill, and depending on which meeting you have in which agency on which day, you may get a very different sense of what U.S. China policy is. And so, as far as the Trump administration is concerned, how do you assess, as an analyst, the focus of its China policy? And then, of course, by extension, how India fits into its larger logic?
So I think this is the most powerful criticism that could be made of the piece, right? That if you assume that the US has a China policy that is coherent, then India fits very nicely into that policy. And that's pretty much the course that we have pursued for at least the last decade. Today, it is unfortunate that the United States does not have a coherent China policy. The president's approach to China appears to be grounded on the assumption that China is a trade problem, not a strategic problem. And if that is the assumption on which our current China policy is based, then you can understand why Indians would be skeptical about the need for partnering with the United States. Because Washington could simply declare a peace pact with China tomorrow. And then the necessity of India relying on the United States or the United States relying on India simply disappears. But the point I make to those who, articulate this criticism is that you've got to recognize that our current absence of mind is really absence of mind that hopefully will have simply a 3-year term. And that after President Trump departs office, the China problem will still remain. And the United States will have objective interests that are competitive with China, irrespective of who holds the presidency. And so when one looks beyond the, pathologies of the moment, I think there are still very good grounds for India to think of the United States as its preferred partner, because the China challenge is not going away. And there are very good grounds, comparably, for the United States to think seriously about India because of the need to manage the China challenge. So if one were simply, for the sake of argument, to abstract from the current problems that we have with the Trump administration's worldview, I would say the broad conclusions of the piece would still hold. That India is going to have a China problem that is going to be far, more difficult to manage than it would be even for the United States. And so the imperatives of India working towards a privileged relationship with Washington remain persistent and become all the more significant as time passes by.
I mean, just to kind of dig into that for a second, Ashley. I mean, in your answer, you alluded to the fact that, look, I mean, it's entirely possible that the president decides that he needs to have a high-level summit with Xi Jinping and strike some kind of G2 accord. That is, of course, the fear that Indian policymakers have long held, which always seemed frankly outlandish until they don't, right? Until now you can kind of see a scenario where maybe that plays out. So given that that is a realistic probability, it would be hard to put a kind of, specific percentage likelihood on that outcome, but it's certainly out there. It's non-zero. Doesn't it make sense for India then to hedge somewhat? Because isn't it the worst of all worlds if China and the U.S. kind of get together in some kind of detente, leaving India out in the cold?
So that makes absolute sense. I understand the temptations that India would have to hedge against a U.S. failure to balance China. And it is entirely possible that in this current Trump term, the U.S. would fail to balance against China. People have already talked about the traditional U.S. objective of preserving its global primacy, slowly devolving into a world where the US begins to recognize spheres of influence. And if the US moved in that direction, then an inevitable consequence of that devolution is that China would become essentially the preeminent power in the Indo-Pacific. And if that's a realistic possibility and the United States is not available to balance, yes, India would be smart to look elsewhere. Except that India has been doing this even when the United States was the primate in the international system. And therefore, the inhibitions are not because of the failures of US policy, even though the failures of US policy are the most prominent driver right now. The inhibitions in India are much more deep-rooted. They have to do with India's vision of itself. It has to do with the troubled history of US India relations and the fact that the United States, as a global power, has relationships with some of India's adversaries that India does not like, most prominently Pakistan. There's a long history to this. So, my simple answer to Indians who make the argument about hedging, because I recognize the logic of hedging, my simple answer to them is there will come a point where the United States will wake up, where it will begin to recognize that its objective interests are not served by splitting the world into spheres of interest, that it will look again for ways to retrieve the primacy it will have lost if it permitted spheres of interest. And when the US gets to that position, India will not be better served by a strategy of hedging, but rather by a strategy of the closest possible relations with Washington. And so in many ways, this peace does not have the tenure of the Trump administration as its temporal horizon, but it's looking at the world of 2047 or 2050. And I think if the United States is not to shoot itself in the foot, it will have no alternative but to protect its primacy over that time frame. And in that kind of a world, US choices towards India and India's choices towards the United States all become, very, very relevant.
So, Ashley, let me ask you one final question before we wrap up, which is you are the kind of leading scholar associated with this phrase, which we've all kind of adopted, called strategic altruism, right? And it comes to my mind most specifically from a piece you wrote for another piece you wrote for Foreign Affairs with Ambassador Bob Blackwell, with whom you served in Delhi, called the India Dividend. And the argument that you made is that, look, from 2000 to 2019, which is when you published the piece, the U.S. has followed this policy of strategic altruism, investing in India's rise because India's rise benefited the United States. And we did not have to ask, as Americans or as a government, what have you done for me lately, India, right? It was not a transactional relationship in which the United States demanded some kind of instant gratification. And obviously, things look very different now, right? I mean, I don't think altruism is really on the menu to these days. So, assuming that, getting back to your idea of, this is an argument about the longue durée, India still needs to survive the next 3 years. And so in a world in which the U.S. is not exhibiting strategic altruism, how would you advise India to navigate the remainder of the Trump term, right? How does it best take advantage of what America has to offer without necessarily doing things that it would find unpalatable or frankly, even impossible for domestic political reasons or other reasons?
So I think what India needs to do is to put time on the clock and to provide the minimal wins that satisfy both sides so that we can build a bridge over the current turbulence. And when times effectively change in Washington, hopefully there will be some incentives to, in a sense, pick up where we last left. And so I think that is what Prime Minister Modi has actually tried to do. But, he's run against the rough shoals of Trump's temperament and sometimes Trump's failure to appreciate the history of this relationship and the neuralgias that still are quite real. But from an Indian point of view, you have to, I think, hunker down, uh, hope that you survive this period without too much damage. But most important of all, I would say, don't give up on the United States. Because if you give up on the United States, you end up in a very different world. Rather, you simply have to accept that relations with Washington are going to be hard to manage, but have to be managed all the same. Because at the end of the day, the US is still the best bet with respect to enhancing Indian security in the geopolitical environment over the next 2 decades. And that geopolitical environment will be marked by China's continued presence, if not ascendancy. And India will simply not have the capacity to deal with that ascendancy by itself. And so keeping the US on side, I think, remains and should remain, I think, the enduring lodestar of Indian geopolitics. Far more than investing in countries like Russia and any other state that, occasionally India may take a fancy to.
My guest on the show this week is my colleague Ashley J. Tellis. He holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also the author of a new essay which appears in the July-August print edition of Foreign Affairs titled India's Great-Power Delusions, How New Delhi's Grand Strategy Thwarts Its Grand Ambitions. Ashley, this was a pleasure to read. It has got a lot of people talking, as I think you know, much like your Foreign Affairs essay of 2 years ago did. Thank you so much for writing the piece and for taking the time.
Thank you. It's always been a pleasure to talk to you.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.